We're dedicating the class tonight, our study tonight, the thoughts that we're going to be reflecting tonight in the Zuchus of a Refuah Shalema for Rafael Tzvi Gedalia Ben Chayek, Refuah Shalema, Gil Evanstein. We took a break for a week, and we had talked a little bit about Chazal. We talked a little bit about creation, and how we can see that the story of Genesis and the origins of cosmology really tends to converge with the biblical and rabbinic depiction of the origins of our universe. I want to contract a little bit, go into something much more tiny. And I want to remind you that we started this series by my telling you that I'm not a scientist. I mean, at least I'm not a physicist. I'm a computer scientist, but that's very far from being a scientist in this sense. And therefore, what interests me most about a discussion of Torah and science is really the philosophy of science, and when we can find convergences and differences between those two philosophies. One of the major studies of philosophy is an area called epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. And what that means is that there is a whole school of thought that spends time trying to figure out how it is that human beings gain knowledge. How do we acquire knowledge of things? And when we study about how the human mind acquires and processes knowledge, then we are engaging in the study of epistemology. Throughout the centuries, there have been debates about how man cognizes, how he attains knowledge. And up through the modern period, there have been two schools of thought. One is known as the school of rationalism, and the other school is the school of empiricism. Now, rationalism does not here mean the type of rationalism of Maimonides. It's a completely different definition because the context is different. Rationalism states that it is possible for a human being to acquire knowledge independent of his external environment. It is possible for me to have certain ideas in my mind, even if those ideas did not come from outside of me. The brain and the mind is capable of cognizing things, of coming up with ideas that are completely independent of my senses. The other school is known as the school of empiricism, which states that the only thing that the mind is capable, the only knowledge that the mind is capable of attaining is information that comes from the senses. And thus, Thomas Aquinas, one of the famous Christian medieval philosophers who was an Aristotelian, said that nothing comes into the mind unless it first goes through the senses. You can only attain a knowledge of certain things, of anything, unless if it's in your environment. According to this theory, if an infant from the time of infancy was placed in a sensory deprivation tank, then it would be impossible for that infant, no matter how mature it becomes and developed it becomes, if it's deprived of sensory information, it can never gain any knowledge. Immanuel Kant talked about these two schools, and he tried to synthesize them, but he talked about these two schools in terms of what we would call a priori knowledge versus a posteriori knowledge. A priori knowledge means that it's possible for a human being to have knowledge independent or prior to the bombardment of the human being from without. And a posteriori means that it's knowledge that is gained or infused into the individual from external factors. Now, why is this relevant? Because modern science, Newtonian science, seems to have told us for centuries, beginning with the modern era of physics, that reality is a product of our environment, reality is a product of the outside world. My mind does not create reality, regardless of whether I'm aware of something or not. The physical reality, the laws of physics, are dictated not by something that goes on in here, but rather what goes on outside of me. Now, you can ask very interesting questions about, if you're a true empiricist, and say that knowledge or reality is only defined by things that are external to the mind. What about knowledge about God? What about knowledge about mathematics? How does that come to a person through a posteriori knowledge? Where is the sensory information provided about things that are supernatural, like God? And a true empiricist would tell you that it comes from an understanding that there must be some kind of nomos, or orderer, a being who creates order within the world that I perceive. That is the conclusion that leads to God. But that the human mind is capable of cognizing God independent of observation is something that an empiricist does not believe. In a similar vein, the mind does not generate or does not come up with information about anything except from the external. And this is only emphasized more and more with this kind of empirical science and empirical physics that becomes in vogue with the Newtonian revolution, that everything has to be demonstrable in a laboratory. There's only one flaw with being a true empiricist and applying that to science. And if I start to lose you, it's because maybe I'm losing myself, I'm not sure. But there's only one flaw. Anytime we try to define physical reality, we're going to end up coming short. Because there's a basic rule of defining things, that if you have to define things by themselves, you haven't really defined it. If the only way you can define an apple is by talking about apples in the definition, I mean, that's the basic rule they tell you when you're writing a dictionary. You can never use the word you're defining in the definition of the word. So if you want to define an apple, and you say, well, it looks like an apple, then you haven't defined it. So how do we define atoms, for example, which we say are the building blocks of all reality? We define atoms by saying that they're like solid billiard balls that are constantly knocking into each other, but just on a very, very small scale. How do we define billiard balls? Well, they're a collection of millions and billions and trillions of atoms that are knocking against each other until they coalesce into solid mass. So we define atoms with the analogy of billiard balls. We define billiard balls by atoms. And so we're defining things. This is not my own argument. This was stated by Sir James Jeans in his famous book called Physics and Philosophy, which was written in the 40s. And he says you can never arrive at a true definition of the physical world around us, because that is our only frame of reference. And if knowledge truly only comes from without, and there is no a priori knowledge that the human being is capable of, then truly you are at a disadvantage of trying to define the world around you, of trying to define the natural order. Okay? So far, you're with me. A related issue. So the famous question, if a tree falls in the forest with no one watching, does it make a noise? Empirical science tells you that of course it makes a noise, because reality is reality independent of the observer or not. Or, to phrase the question another way, does consciousness determine what exists? Or is there a reality that exists independently of our consciousness? So up until the 20th century, the answer seemed fairly obvious, that independent of any observer, independent of any person's consciousness, reality is objective. Reality is it's an objective reality. There are two fields of physics that started to challenge that premise. First of all, we have to appreciate that the human mind is constantly trying to make sense and order. As I mentioned, the word nomos is to create order out of that which may appear to be chaotic. So we will never really know if the things that we use and the terms and the quantities and the objects that we use to define our universe are real, as an empiricist would tell you, or whether they're a product of the mind trying to create order out of something which really defies order. But if you truly are an empiricist, then consider this. One of the things that Descartes used to challenge empiricism was, how do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? How do I know that anything that I am perceiving in the outside world is real? And there has to be a sense of skepticism anytime we start thinking about the physical universe. How do I know that what I'm currently perceiving with my senses is actually real? Now, of course, we can take this to an extreme. There's a school of philosophy called solipsism, which suggests that really nothing can be proven to be real. And indeed, there may not be anyone here. You may be the only person in this room, and everyone else, and my voice is merely a creation of your own mind. I'll never forget the time that I was in chemistry class in grade 10, many years ago. And my chemistry teacher came to us and said, I want to tell you a story about a little boy. A few years ago, this little boy was riding his bicycle, and he was in a terrible, terrible accident. And he was hit on his bike, and the doctors took him to the emergency, and they realized that his body was completely and utterly destroyed, and there was really no hope to save him. But there was one brilliant physician who said to the parents, we can't save your son's body, but we can save his brain. I've hooked up to a computer a system whereby I can preserve your son's brain in fluid, and I will program using certain sensors attached to the brain that will attach to this computer that will make your son believe that he is still alive inside a body, and the program in the computer will replicate the life of an 8-year-old little boy, and he will continue to grow because we'll change the program as the years progress, and he will perceive the world as it was before he had his accident. And this boy, the parents finally consented. They hooked up his brain to a computer, and the boy thought that he was still alive. This was this virtual reality. Of course, when I was in 10th grade, they didn't call it virtual reality back then. And the boy continues thinking that he's alive, living his life. And the doctor, because as doctors and scientists usually are, is very curious. He says to himself one day, what would happen to the psyche of this brain if I decided to try and notify the brain that he is not really a human being like everyone else, but he's merely a brain in a petri dish? What would the reaction of the brain be? And the doctor said, well, we have to do it in such a gentle way so as not to traumatize psychologically and emotionally the psyche of this very frail little brain that's in the petri dish. So the doctor decided one day that he would send someone in the program, a person that the child implicitly trusted, and this person would tell the story about this little boy. And that concluded my chemistry teacher is why I'm here today. So that sort of spooked this all out. But the point is, that's what solipsism is. How do you know that you're all here? How do you know that any of us are here? Maybe everyone else in this room is a figment of your imagination. Now, how does that have an impact upon my life as an observant Jew? On the one hand, I have to be skeptical about my physical reality, and that really, on a deeper level, nothing is real. But at the same time, what if my conception of God, what if my conception of Torah, what if all of this, the Taryag mitzvahs, the Shulchan Aruch, the Gemara, rabbis, synagogues, all of this was created by my mind? And really I'm just a brain in a petri dish, floating somewhere in the cosmos where none of these things are real. The answer is we don't know. but we have to conduct ourselves according to a certain order, because the alternative is to just despair into nothingness. And so therefore, on one level, nothing is real, but at the same time, we have to comport ourselves as if everything is real. Now, if we're going to comport ourselves as if everything is real, we still are going to be left with the question. Science, up until very recently, has told us that there's an objective reality that runs fatalistically, that runs deterministically, and that we don't have any effect on the way that nature runs itself through the course of time. But there are two things that happened in the 20th century that sort of derailed that idea. One is the theory of special and general relativity that was put forth by Einstein. And I'm not an expert, but the idea, of course, is that reality changes, physical reality changes, depending upon the motion of the observer. So when I talk about physical reality, I'm talking about both time and space. Time slows down, the faster the rate of acceleration of the individual, and mass increases based upon the rate of acceleration of the individual. The faster the individual goes, the slower time becomes, so that for the person in the space capsule that's approaching the speed of light, he's only experiencing a few seconds, whereas people who are stationary watching the space capsule, years and years and years can go by. And space also, the individual becomes a heavier, larger mass the more he approaches the speed of light, whereas stationary bodies retain their integrity and don't change their mass. So this tells us that the individual, in relation to both time and space, can change. That time and space are not absolutes, that they are subject to change based upon changes of energy and changes of condition. So if I'm moving, my reality is different from when I'm stationary. And by the way, all of us are moving. We're moving about 80,000 miles an hour through space. And that's why our physical reality is the way it is. If the Earth was to stop immediately, stop revolving around the sun, so then the laws of physics would have to adjust themselves in accordance to the more rapid time flow and to the lower level of mass. So that's where we get into this. That's what relativity is all about, that there is not an objective physical reality. Things change based upon their position in the universe. So that's one idea to think about. And then the second thing that happened in the 20th century that was even more revolutionary than the theory of relativity was quantum physics. And again, I'm not an expert on quantum physics. I never studied physics formally in university. But one thing I can tell you about physics, about quantum physics, is that it has created a certain level of uncertainty about subatomic particles. You might have heard about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. What is that all about, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle? Well, scientists came up with this idea. They noticed that electrons and also photons, which are particles of light, have the characteristics of particles. They also noticed that photons and electrons have the characteristics in their motion of waves, of energy waves. And it was not always predictable when an electron or a photon would behave as a particle and when it would behave as a wave. You may have heard about the double slit experiment, where what scientists discovered is that when you shoot a photon or a series of photons through two slits, the beams of light collide with each other because they have wave-like properties, and that manifests itself in the way that the light refracts off of the surface, the back surface where the light is shining, through those two slits. If you were to shoot only one photon through an environment which has two slits, it depends whether the photon will go through one slit or whether the photon will go through two slits. It all depends on whether there's an observer present or not. And this is one of the anomalies that quantum physics presented us with. When there's an observer present, the photon will travel through either one of the two slits. But when there is no observer present, the photon behaves as a wave, and in a strange fashion, even though there's only one photon, it manages to break up into a wave structure and goes through both slits. I don't claim to understand the computations fully, but one thing is clear, is that the presence of an observer changes the qualities, at least the way we've defined the qualities of subatomic particles of light and electrons. Now, if that's the case, that says something very earth-shattering about the relativity between the observer, the human being, and physical reality. No longer can we say objectively that physical reality outside of my mind is static and unchanging. My mind plays a role on what is contained within the physical reality. Now, a person could argue that that only works on a subatomic level. Let's see it work on a macrocosmic level. So there's a thought experiment that was invented by a guy named Edwin Schrödinger, also sometime in the earlier part of the 20th century, and there's a famous thing called Schrödinger's cat, where he creates a system whereby you could translate this onto the macro level. But in any event, what it turns out is that there's really an uncertainty whether certain particles behave as wave or light, depending upon, you can ascertain where the particle is, but the more you ascertain where it is, the less you can ascertain its particle-like features. And the more that you can ascertain the location the more that you ascertain the particle features of the object, the less that you can ascertain its location in the system. That's what's known as the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and it creates like a black box in nature. So what Niels Bohr, who was one of the fathers of quantum physics, what he came to the conclusion of is that he said, based upon this anomaly, based upon the bizarre behavior of subatomic particles, we have to conclude that photons and electrons are neither particles or waves, but rather it is our mind defines quanta, our mind defines particles, or these particles of energy, in one of two ways, when in reality there's a third definition that our mind simply can't understand. So we're really just scratching the surface of some of these scientific discoveries of the 20th century, and there's even more to talk about when we get to even more complex discussions, which are certainly beyond me, but they're interesting to discuss. But one of the ideas here is that no longer can we say that our physical universe is deterministic, that everything unfolds without human intervention, that nature commences on its path, and there's nothing that we can do to change it. Clearly, the presence of a human being and the position of that human being changes physical reality, whether you look at the theory of relativity or whether you look at quantum physics. So these are all interesting ideas, but where does it get us in our thinking about Torah and our thinking about Judaism? Well, for one thing, we have to remember that the physical world as we know it may very well be just a facade for what's real reality. And the more that we discover about the mysteries of the physical universe, the more that we realize that what we understand to be real is really our mind trying to create the nomos, trying to create the order, using certain nomenclature and certain definitions that work within the limitations of our minds. But whether those systems that we perceive as existing outside of our mind are really truly the way that we think that they are, seems to be not the case. It seems to be that we define things based on five senses: on sight, on hearing, on touch, smell, and taste. But there may be other ways of defining these things that far surpass those sensory perceptions. And that seems to be something that has been confirmed when we look at the theory of relativity and quantum physics. Once we're forced to acknowledge that there are certain phenomena that we cannot apprehend, we cannot comprehend empirically, it doesn't take a tremendous leap of faith to accept the possibility of even sentient beings, such as God or angels, that are not empirically detectable. Because we've demonstrated that not everything can be detected, or at least detected accurately in our world. So, in halacha, we have a definition of reality. If you recall, going back a few weeks, we defined halachic reality as that which is perceptible to the senses. That's why we said that it is permissible on Shabbos to kill lice. You can kill lice on Shabbos. Because halacha says that as a human being, God, who gave us the halachic system, recognizes our limitations. And because to the naked eye, lice do not seem to reproduce in a normative fashion from a mother and a father and being hatched from an egg, it is therefore not considered a life for which I'm liable for taking if I do it on Shabbos. Because we learn from the Gemara that the only time that I'm liable for taking a life on Shabbos is if that life was created from a mother and a father, just like most animals in the animal kingdom. So the perception of the human being is that lice are generated from perspiration, and even if therefore that's not the physical reality, because under a microscope we note that lice reproduce from eggs just like other insects and other organisms, nevertheless halachically our senses define the halachic reality. But what defines the reality outside of the halachic system? Just like empirical science is not the end-all of all of reality, we have to also accept that the halachic paradigm is not the end-all of where we perceive God and reality. So that's something also that we have to think about. Both in science and in Judaism, we have to accept the fact that there are parameters for the way that we live our lives as Jews, using a halachic system, but that there are also things that transcend the halachic system that we can't necessarily monitor and see. And that's where we get into ideas of mysticism. That's where we get into an appreciation of the fact, like the Baal HaTanya says, that this world was not created yesh me'ayin. This world was not created ex nihilo, something from nothing, but rather this world is ayin meyesh. It is really nothingness from something. That really what we are witnessing, what we are experiencing, is really a pale representation of true reality, which transcends far beyond the physical world. That's my talk for tonight. And that's how we're going to end this series. Anyone want to comment? Anyone want to say anything? Yes.
This definition, you're responding to right now, and also earlier with the solipsism, is that the phrase olam sheker? Is that relevant to what you're...
Olam sheker or olam hafuch, an upside down world or a false world. Yeah, there's a lot of falseness. Look, there are a lot of mysteries in theology as well. The famous mystery that the Rambam writes, how could you reconcile determinism with free will? How do you reconcile it? The Rambam says that at the end of the day we have to resign ourselves to what the Prophet says, Ki lo machshavosai machshavosechem v'lo darchechem derachaynu Hashem. My thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways, says Hashem. And the Rambam says, therefore, there are certain limitations to the human mind where we perceive things to be at odds with each other, but they're really not. We could say the same thing about quantum physics. The mind looks at a system and says it either has to be a particle or a wave. It can't be both, because that seems to defy the rules. And yet, we're forced to acknowledge that it exists. Yes, Ezra.
I wonder about the conclusion that Rabbi is making from like modern day physics to the existence of God, because isn't it going the other way? Like what modern physics says is what we perceive as reality is perhaps not reality. Like we think an atom is right here, but in actual fact it's not here. It has a certain probability of being here, a certain probability of being here, and a certain probability of being here, and that all adds up to what we perceive as reality, being here, but it's not reality. But the existence of God is something that we don't perceive, and we're saying reality can exist, God can exist, even though we don't perceive him.
All I'm suggesting is that what quantum physics demonstrates is that our perceptions of reality are not faithful all the time.
Right, but it doesn't demonstrate that our perceptions of, or our non-perceptions of reality are any less accurate.
Yes, that's also true. That's also true. But it does demonstrate to us that there's far more that makes up reality than what we perceive. Because if we can't trust our senses to accurately portray reality, then we have to resign ourselves to the fact that not everything that exists is perceivable. That's the point that I wanted to make, and it goes back to this idea about how does man conceive of God? Does man conceive of God a priori or a posteriori? In Judaism, we believe in this idea of the Tzelem Elokim, that human beings are born with a certain spark of the divine within us, and that enables us to connect to the divine independent of our environment. But it's not kfira, it's not heresy to say that our understanding of the Ribono Shel Olam comes from a posteriori knowledge, right? That our understanding of Hashem comes from an observation of the world around us that allows us to conclude that God exists. But either way, right? Either way, that a person cannot be a hardcore empiricist, because we've demonstrated that not all knowledge comes from the outside world. At least not a perfect understanding of reality comes from the outside world, from a sensory perception. Yes, Dr. Korobkin.
If you have X number of normal people and the same number of schizophrenics, then one will say that's a chair, and the other will say that's a table. Who's right?
Exactly.
Because as you're talking about...
Who's the schizophrenic and who's the regular person?
Yeah, I know, but in other words, for them, reality is a chair versus a table.
Yeah.
Can they be both? I don't know.
You and I can look at the same piece of fabric, and we can both acknowledge that it's blue. But one thing is clear, is that you don't see the same blue that I do. We can come to a consensus of blueness in a piece of fabric by polling enough people. But we also know that no two eyes perceive color exactly the same. So that also, I mean, that's part of the philosophical discussion of a priori versus a posteriori.
So is reality in the eyes of the beholder, in a way?
To a certain extent it is. And that's, my point is that modern science demonstrates that as well.
Would you say that sensory deprived infant you talked about could grow up and become a God-fearing person?
I don't know about God-fearing, but at least come to certain... So it's very possible. I don't know. I can't prove it one way or the other, but if you subscribe to the idea that Tzelem Elokim can provide a person with a priori knowledge about God and certain instincts about reality, then the child can gain knowledge on its own. Without, or generate knowledge, the mind can come to certain conclusions without sensory perception. Yes,
most Muslims today say it's mutter asr to lice on Shabbos.
Most poskim say that it's mutter to kill lice on Shabbos because halacha is defined by perceptible sensory perception.
Even at the radio level.
Yeah. I mean, thank God we've solved most lice problems. Yeah.
I think they come together very nicely at the end. The only thing I'm wondering is, weren't we all at Sinai? Didn't we hear and see everything? Was that reality? Or is there a doubt about that?
The Chazal tell us that our neshamas were all at Har Sinai. But even if you don't subscribe to that as the basis for our faith, but rather the fact that we are recipients of an eyewitness account that's been passed down through the generations, we are able to say that the halachic paradigm is dictated by our senses. We practice the mitzvahs today because of a perception of divine revelation, a perception that was received by masses and masses of Jews. So there's consensus that was the perception of reality. And we guide our lives by sensory perception of reality. That defines our reality, and that's why we have to observe the mitzvos, because we believe that we experienced God on a sensory level. The question then becomes, what was that experience? Was it an empirically demonstrable experience? For example, if you had a video camera at Har Sinai, would you have been able to capture the voice of God at Har Sinai? Or was this a voice that was only implanted within the minds of the Jewish people that was not part of their environment? Was it a priori revelation, or was it a posteriori revelation? How does revelation occur to an individual? And so I don't think that a person can demonstrate it one way or the other. And that's why Judaism is never about being able to prove something to be true based upon sensory experience, but rather based upon revelation. Revelation can either be a sensory empirical experience, or it can be a mental experience. But either way, it's revelation, because the individual who's experiencing it, or the individuals experiencing it, know without a shadow of a doubt what that experience is.
We all had it.
We all had it.
The same perception.
We all had that same perception. Whether or not, the Rambam writes that there was no actual voice of God that thundered forth from Sinai. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says that there was an audible voice. This is part of the machlokas as to what role the physical world plays in our experience of God. Yes?
Don't we understand as Hashem being the ultimate reality?
Yes. That God is the ultimate reality. Right? But the question is, what is everything else? It may not be real at all. Yeah. Yes?
Just an interesting footnote to what you were saying is that Einstein, till his dying day, refused to believe that quantum physics was a valid theory.
It disturbed him greatly.
He believed, he wasn't religious in a traditional sense, but I think his famous quote was, "God doesn't play dice with the universe," or something.
Right, because he felt that there has to be certainty within the physical world, that you should be able to quantify everything. And this Heisenberg uncertainty principle bothered him, because it basically said you can't know with certainty both the place of and its quanta and its mass.
And he also believed that ultimately quantum theory would be proven to be some sort of intermediate theory that would be superseded by a more all-encompassing theory that would
the theory of everything.
Differences.
Yeah,
I think that's where modern physics is headed.
Yeah, that's where modern physics is headed. We're not there yet, but that's where we're headed, trying to figure out everything that exists in the physical world. Okay, anyway, interesting thought, interesting philosophy of science. That's about as far as I can go. There are plenty of great books that you can discover on your own if this kind of stuff interests you. But thank you all for coming.